We get a new sefer this week, Sefer Vayikra. It deals with korbanos, animal sacrifice. So there are a few ideas that I think are important to lay down just as an introduction. One of the fundamentals of faith, one of the 13 fundamentals, is that the Torah cannot and will not be changed. That the Torah is eternal. That the 613 mitzvahs are everlasting. Now that doesn't mean that there are not historical periods in which some of the mitzvahs aren't observed. As we know, we don't have a temple today, and we don't perform animal sacrifice. But that's not because we've transcended to a higher form of religion. That's because we're constrained by circumstances beyond our control, and we can't perform the mitzvah. Imagine a person in jail and has no access to tefillin, no access to a talis, no access to a shofar, no access to a lulav. So he won't perform those mitzvahs, not because they aren't obligatory, not because they aren't binding, simply because he doesn't have the opportunity. So as well, we don't have a temple, and therefore we can't perform the sacrifices. But it's not because the sacrifices lack significance or that we've grown or developed beyond that. And accordingly, we pray that when Mashiach comes, that we should be able to bring the sacrifices, and anyone who prays Musaf on Shabbos and Yom Tov knows that there, when the temple is rebuilt, we will perform the sacrifices, and we cite the relevant biblical passage which speaks about the sacrifices for that holiday or for the Shabbos, and we express our confidence that when Mashiach comes, we are going to bring those sacrifices. Some people mistakenly believe that's not the case. Some people think that animal sacrifice is a vestige of a more primitive age. People weren't so sophisticated, people were influenced by pagan practices, so Jews as well practice this. But certainly when Mashiach comes, we're not going to revert back to such barbaric practices. And it's interesting, in the 1948 edition of the conservative prayer book, the one edited by Morris Silverman, which I think for many decades was the mainstay of most conservative congregations. So in the introduction to the book, he says this as axiomatic, that of course we are not praying or hoping for the restoration of animal sacrifice. And accordingly, in the conservative prayer book, the text of the prayer is amended. That there, it does not read, Visham na'aseh lefonecha, and there we will bring the animal sacrifices, but rather, Shesham osu lefonecha. It's a reference to the past, that we, with some nostalgia, we recognize that once upon a time we brought these sacrifices and we refer to them. Though it's hard to understand that if in fact we don't anticipate their being restored and we look at them as being a vestige of a primitive time, what is the point of even mentioning them in the prayer? I mean, I don't understand what the point would be. But this is what he says. And I once was speaking about this subject to a group of good Jews. One of them was a member of a conservative congregation. And I was talking about this idea that when Mashiach comes, the sacrifices will be restored. And I mentioned that in the conservative movement, they don't believe this. So this man innocently said, I don't believe that in the conservative movement they reject the possibility of the restoration of animal sacrifice. He believes that it must be. He even asked his rabbi. He said, "Well, ask the rabbi." So he asked his rabbi. I won't mention the rabbi's name. He was a well-known conservative rabbi here in Toronto. And he asked him, when the Mashiach comes, will sacrifices be brought? So, why do you ask? He says, because the rabbi that I study with during the week said that in the conservative movement they don't believe in the restoration of animal sacrifice. So the rabbi said, If that is the only criticism Rabbi Breitowitz has of the conservative movement, I don't feel so bad. But you should know that if you throw out sacrifice, how many of the 613 mitzvahs are you discarding? How many of the 613 relate to the temple, the offerings of the temple, the purity, that's relevant to the temple? About a quarter, 150 mitzvahs. So you're not throwing out one or two, not to say that it would make a difference. It's not a question of how many you're throwing out. If you believe the Torah is eternal, you can't throw out a fraction of one, let alone throw out 100. But actually, there are about 150 mitzvahs, so a quarter of the Torah is related to the idea of sacrifice. This is an important thing we have to understand. And maybe a little bit later tonight, we'll explain where this error may have crept in, even among some good Jews. But this is clear from our liturgy that we anticipate that the temple should be rebuilt and we're going to bring animal sacrifice. So the question is, we have to understand it. In other words, obviously, if we look at it as something barbaric, something primitive, it would be very hard to want its restoration. So we have to really understand what the idea behind korbanos is. And just as an aside to whet your appetite for our discussion, I'll just mention a very interesting question. The first word of the Parsha is Vayikra, that God called to Moshe Rabbeinu. But if you look in the Sefer Torah, you can find a very interesting thing, that the Aleph, the last Aleph of Vayikra, is written small, smaller than the letters which come before and which follow. It's called the Aleph Ze'ira, the very small Aleph. So the question is, what is the point of the very small Aleph? So the Mefarshim, the Balaturim, others point out the following, that we learn from this verse, Vayikra el Moshe, that whenever God spoke to Moshe, there always was an invitation. There always was a calling. He called Moshe, he invited Moshe to come into the Mishkan for a conversation. Bilam, who was the wicked counterpart of Moshe Rabbeinu, when God spoke to him, it says Vayikar, that God chanced upon Bilam. There was no appointment, there was no scheduling. It was like as if God bumped into him and said, "Hey, come here, I got something to tell you." Which gives the impression that, had Bilam not been there, perhaps God wouldn't have spoken to him. Now, it just happens to be that, let's say, for example, I had some interesting Torah thought to say, and I would go over to someone and say, "You happen to be standing here, come here, I'll tell it to you." And if you wouldn't have been standing here, I wouldn't call you, I wouldn't pursue you. You're convenient, you're available. So that's the impression, that Moshe Rabbeinu was valued by God. So when God wants to speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, he invites him, he calls him, says Bilam is not valuable. Right? So if he happens to be around, God will speak to him. If he's not there, God won't speak to him. So it's Vayikar, it's a chance encounter. Now, the two words are very, very similar. Vayikar is Vav Yud Kuf Reish, and Vayikra is also Vav Yud Kuf Reish, just as the Aleph in the end. Well, the terms are like this. That Moshe Rabbeinu was very uncomfortable writing this word Vayikra, because it's this word with the Aleph that really defines the difference between him and the wicked Bilam. It calls attention to himself, to his greater stature. So he wasn't comfortable with that. He wanted to write the word Vayikar, just as is written in the case of Bilam. And God wanted him to write Vayikra. So what was the compromise? The compromise was that the Aleph, which makes all the difference, Moshe write it very small. He write it very small. And of course, this is totally, we all understand this, because Moshe Rabbeinu, the great virtue which the Torah says of Moshe Rabbeinu was his humility. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't want to write something about himself which accentuates his virtue, and therefore he would have preferred to write it the other way. God insisted, but Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it small. Now there's a tradition that's brought down. It's an amazing, amazing thing. The it says that Moshe Rabbeinu's countenance shone, his face shone. And where did that radiance come from? There's a medrash which says that when Moshe Rabbeinu was writing the Sefer Torah, there was a drop of ink left in the pen, and he put this ink on his head, and from that came the radiance. So the question is that when there's a drop of ink left over, why did God give him an extra drop of ink? Whereas a human being, when he buys ink, obviously there'll be some extra ink. But if God gave him the pen with which he wrote the Sefer Torah, God should have given him exactly enough ink. Where did this extra drop come from? So one of the interpretations which is said, it doesn't really work out, but it's a cute thought, that it was the extra ink that he would have used had he written that Aleph large. So since he wrote that Aleph small, so there was a little bit of ink left. And that ink he put in his head, and that created the radiance. Which tells us a very important thing, that when you flee honor, honor catches up with you. So Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to flee the honor of writing Vayikra. He wanted to write Vayikra, the compromise which he write it small. And from that little ink that he saved, from that there was the Karan or Panav, his countenance shone. Everyone could see that he essentially was like an angel.
Doesn't it also tell us something about free will?
Well, I don't know.
On some level, God knew that he would write the little Aleph.
Yeah, probably it was negotiated. It wasn't that he did it against God's will. Right. They probably had a discussion and God relented. But the interesting thing is, just as an aside, that is true about honor. Because I'll say if a person runs away from honor, honor pursues him. So it's just interesting. I just mentioned as an aside, not as any relevance to this discussion, that the great Rav Dessler once said that, okay, so you run away from honor, honor runs after you, but you're still running. So when does it ever catch up? He says it catches up when a person dies. Because then he has to stop running. When he stops running, that's when the honor catches up. So if a person runs away from honor in his lifetime, he runs, the honor is chasing him, but never catches up. But when he dies, he has to stop running, that's when ultimately the honor catches up. But in any case, the question is this, that there are many, many places in the Torah where the Torah could have hinted to this humility. Why is it specifically in this parsha, the parsha of Korbanos, that it's just here we have that little Aleph, which alludes to the great humility of Moshe Rabbeinu? Now, let's talk a little bit about the idea of an animal sacrifice. And maybe we'll come back to this little Aleph. Now, the Hebrew word karbon does not have the implication of sacrifice. Karbon is from the Hebrew word karov, which means to come close. It's a ritual through which we become closer to God. There's no implication of giving up something, surrendering something. Somehow in English, the word karbon became translated as sacrifice, which has a different connotation. That the idea that underlies the karbon is the giving up, the surrender of a thing which is valuable and precious to me. That's what it seems. So I don't think we should assume that the English translation is correct just because it's the common use. Because if it doesn't really correspond to the Hebrew word, then probably it isn't an accurate depiction of the concept. And yet, I think in most people's thinking, there is this element of giving up. Whereas you are giving up something which is of value to you. Certainly in ancient societies, animals were the great source of wealth. Livestock was, after land, a person's most precious asset. And therefore, we can understand the element of sacrifice. Of course, it becomes a little more difficult when we talk about the Torah being eternal. In other words, in ancient times, yes, animals played a very important role in the economy, but nowadays, not as important. I mean, perhaps we should consider automobile sacrifice. You know, it's interesting because there are laws that pertain to animals. An animal can't have a defect. If an animal has a blemish, a mum, it's invalid as a carbon. So I guess if you would be sacrificing an automobile, also going to have a defect. Like a Toyota maybe would be. Couldn't bring it as a sacrifice. But so that's a problem. The Ramban says that the idea of an animal sacrifice obviously is not because of the monetary value of the sacrifice. It's because an animal is the closest thing there is to a human being. That's why we sacrifice animals. Because if you want to symbolize something which is done through a human being, the closest symbol is the animal. And specifically the domesticated animal. Because the domesticated animal is part of human society. The Ramban understands that a sacrifice is a symbolic execution. But it's always related to sin in some way, and the person by bringing the sacrifice is showing that really that should be done to me. For my sins, I should be slaughtered, I should be skinned, I should be cut up into pieces, I should be burnt on the altar, and so on and so forth. And it's a vicarious execution. That's what the Ramban seems to put it. Now, it would seem that theory is a little bit incomplete, because we know there are certain sacrifices which are not brought as atonement for sin. There are certain sacrifices that are called nidava, neder. They are voluntary sacrifices. How do you understand that? The Ramban doesn't go into detail, but this is the principle the Ramban lays down. The Sfas Emes says something a little different, a drop different. He says that it's not a vicarious execution, but it's a vicarious self-sacrifice. What does it mean? It's like this. That every person has his own priorities, his own interests, his own goals, the things he wants to achieve in life. And God makes requests of us. So I want you to do mitzvahs, I want you to learn Torah, I want you to give charity. And that demands of us that we put aside our own interests, our own priorities, and instead bend to the will of God. That's a form of sacrifice. Because I'm giving up what I want for the sake of what God wants. Killing oneself would be very much symbolic of that type of self-sacrifice, except it would miss the point entirely. In other words, the type of sacrifice that God wants is not our deaths, but our lives, our actions. That we live lives of meaning, lives of purpose in accordance with His will. That's the type of sacrifice He wants. But nevertheless, symbolically executing ourselves is a very powerful symbol of that self-sacrifice. My 100 total % devotion to the will of God is symbolized by a ritual self-sacrifice. So when we take the animal, it's not that I am slaughtering the animal to symbolize an execution, a punishment, an atonement. I am slaughtering the animal to symbolize that in the same way that I don't keep any of this for myself. I'm willing to give it totally to God, so I am willing to give myself totally 100% to God. Now the interesting thing that Sfas Emes says is that where do we bring the sacrifices? We bring the sacrifices in the temple in Yerushalayim. What happened on that spot? Because we know that the Akedah, this was the place where Avram Avinu was meant to sacrifice his son. What was the resolution of the story of the Akedah? It says that Avram brought the ram Tachas Beno, in place of his son. And the Rashi tells us from the Medrash an amazing thing, that as Avram performed the ritual on this ram, he prayed that everything he does to the ram should be considered in God's eyes as if he did it to Yitzchak. It should be so acceptable to God. Because what is the idea? So the Sassemis explains, because the real sacrifice is you're bending your will to the will of God. Avram wanted a child more than anything. God comes to him and says that I want that child. And Avram gave it up gladly. He was willing to put aside his own desire for the will of God. Slaughtering a ram was no big deal. It wasn't even his ram. It was a wild ram that he found in the bush. So there was no element of sacrifice, surrender. He wanted that as he performed this symbolic self-sacrifice, or sacrifice of his son, every act in the ritual should be as if he did it to Yitzchak. And Chazal tell us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at it that way. It's an amazing thing. The Gemara in Maseches Taina says that on a fast day, people put ashes on their heads, on the ark. So the Gemara says, why did they put ashes on the ark? This is to remind us of the ashes of Yitzchak Avinu, the ashes of Isaac, who was burnt on the altar. So the obvious question is, the ashes of Isaac that were burnt on the altar. Isaac never was burnt on the altar. The ram was brought instead. And the answer is because Avram's prayer was answered. There was Avram's prayer that everything that Avram does to the ram should be considered as if he did it to Yitzchak was answered in the affirmative. And therefore, God, when he looks upon that sight, doesn't see the ashes of a ram, he sees the ashes of Yitzchak. Not that it really happened, but this was the power of Avram's prayer. So that spot became the spot where the slaughtering of an animal is considered in God's eyes as if a person performed the ultimate sacrifice. And therefore it was established that at that point, for eternity, that is the way it would be. That's what the Sfasema says. So that's what the idea of a carbon is.
This is exactly what God was against, firmly against animal sacrifice in the first place?
No. See, what God is against...
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
You know sacrifice. Now, there is a theme that runs through the Nevi'im, through the prophets, that God is displeased with animal sacrifice. But that means he's displeased with animal sacrifice where it doesn't come from deep-seated conviction, where it's just the animal. Where it's about the cow, that's where God is uninterested and displeased. But where the sacrifice really is brought as a self-sacrifice, that's the thing which is most pleasing to God.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
Question.
How significant is the concept that if there wasn't the Avera of the Hegel, there's an opinion that we wouldn't have the mitzvahs of the sacrifice altogether?
No, there's no such opinion. There's no such opinion. There's a shita in Rishonim that there wouldn't have been a temple. No sacrifice could have been performed anywhere. But sacrifice would have been performed, even if it was not for the Chet HaEgel. Sacrifice was performed for the Chet HaEgel.
Right, but then would we still have these this quarter of the 613 mitzvahs pertaining to?
You know, if we didn't have the Chet HaEgel, we probably would have different mitzvahs. It's a good question. Right? See, you're raising a question which has to be answered in any case. We know there are certain mitzvahs that relate to historic events. Some of those historic events were a consequence of choices people made. If people would have made different choices, what would have happened to those mitzvahs? Probably would be different. I mean, what would the Torah have looked like had Korach not rebelled? Had Bilam not tried to curse the Jewish people? Had Moshe not hit the rock? No, it would be different. It would be different, but in a sense the same. What do I mean in a sense the same? In other words, the fundamental principle would be unchanging. In other words, how the story would unfold would be different. But that very different Torah would still be very, very much along the same lines as the Torah which we do have. So this is the idea of the sacrifice, of the sasevis. It's the vicarious, not vicarious execution, but the vicarious self-sacrifice. It's the negation of my will to the will of God. Now, there's a question that we have to ask ourselves. This is a little bit of a knotty question. We don't have a temple nowadays. So how do we make up for the lack of the Beis Hamikdash, lack of animal sacrifice? So the verse says, "U'nishalma parim sfoseinu." We compensate for the oxen that we don't bring with the words of our lips. Prayer is a replacement for sacrifice. Prayer replaces sacrifice. Now, at first glance, this is very, very hard to understand. How could prayer possibly replace sacrifice? If sacrifice is the idea of self-sacrifice, giving up, surrendering that which is valuable to me, symbolically surrendering my will, my priorities, my desires, how could prayer possibly replace that? Prayer is the opposite. Prayer is, in a sense, the most self-serving thing that we do. We come to God and we give him a list of things. I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. Give me, give me, give me, give me. So it seems that prayer is the exact opposite of sacrifice. Sacrifice is about what I want isn't important. All I want to do is your will. I don't care about my comfort. I don't care about my pleasure. I don't care about anything. And prayer is the exact opposite. Prayer is the place where we are asking more and more and more and more and more. And just to fully appreciate the question, we know that prayer has many component parts. The Shemona Esrei, the silent prayer that we say, really has a threefold division. It begins with praise of God. Then we go to the central portion in which we make requests of God. And we end with thanks of God. Now the Gemara says that this really is rooted in common etiquette. If you're going before a king, you wouldn't begin with your requests. First, you praise the king. Oh, your royal highness, you're so wonderful and great and magnificent. And then you would make your requests, and even before he has time to answer, you would say, thank you so much for considering my request, and so on and so forth. So it's really etiquette.
Where is this in the Gemara?
It's Gemara in a few places. Gemara in Brachos, Gemara in Wed May. So now the question is like this. But if that is true, if the structure of prayer really is just a reflection of manners, then what is the essential part of the prayer? Well, by analogy, when I go to the king, and I begin with the lavish praise, I end with the lavish thanks, but really what am I doing? I'm asking my requests. So it seems that's the central part of prayer. This etiquette requires that you introduce the requests with praise, and you follow the requests with thanks. But the appearance itself is for the purpose of making requests. So that's, by analogy, the central aspect of prayer. The central aspect of the prayer is the bakasha, is the request. So how can that possibly replace sacrifice? Seems very, very, very odd. I think the answer to that question is like this. That people are willing to give up much. People are willing to give up their money. They're willing to give up their time. They're willing to give up their preferences. But one thing people aren't so willing to give up is their value, their self-esteem, their self-worth. That people aren't willing to sacrifice. In other words, I'll give you my time, I'll give you my money, but I still want to think of myself as a valuable person, as a meaningful person, as a person who has value, worth. And to the contrary, when I give you my money and give you my time, when I do favors for you, that boosts my self-worth. I'm an important person, I'm a significant person, I make a contribution. I feel good about that. Sometimes we feel best about the things we do for others. To the contrary, when we do for ourselves, then we feel, I'm so selfish, I'm so self-centered, egotistical. It's only when I do for others that I feel good about myself. Listen, I've sacrificed, I've contributed to the community. I feel good. Another way in which we feel good about ourselves is when we see ourselves as being self-sufficient. We can take care of ourselves. I can attend to my own needs. I'm independent. With older people, this is such an important part of their lives. As they get older, they become less self-sufficient. They want to be able to hold on to that last bit of independence, take care of themselves, attend to their needs, cook for themselves, clean for themselves, go where they need to go for themselves, not they have to be taken around, and so on and so forth. It's very, very painful when they come to the realization that they can't do the things they used to be able to do. They're dependent on others. And it's almost tragic when our parents reach that stage of life where they become our children. Imagine, these are our parents. They raised us, they fed us, they diapered us. And as the infirmities of old age set in, everything is reversed. Now we have to take care of them. And, any person who finds himself in that situation has to be very, very, very careful to be mindful and to preserve and protect the dignity of that elderly parent. But you certainly don't want to take care of the parent in such a way that you treat them like a child. It's one thing to have to feed your parent, but don't say, now open wide, right? That's how you feed a 3-year-old. Now, you don't feed your parent that way. But in any case, when we pray, that is exactly what we are surrendering. We are surrendering the illusion of being self-sufficient. We are standing before God and we are saying we are helpless. We cannot satisfy our needs. We can't provide sustenance for ourselves. We cannot guarantee our own health, as much as President Obama thinks that he can do it. He can't do it. We cannot solve the problems that face Klal Yisrael. The political problems, the religious problems, these are only going to be solved by God when He sends Mashiach. And, if you really pray, if you ever really pray and think about what you're saying and really say it with feeling and mean it, it's a very humbling experience. Now, I think it has to be said that many of us recite the prayers on a regular basis, but very few of us really pray. I'm not criticizing you, I'm saying about myself as well. Very rarely do we really feel deeply what we're saying. But if we really said the prayers with that depth of meaning, the feeling that should overwhelm us is a sense of hopelessness, that we are totally incompetent, unable to provide for ourselves. We are utterly, utterly dependent on God alone. That's what the essence of prayer is. Now, I'll share with you a very interesting thing. That, the Gemara says that when the great sage Rava prayed, he would clasp his hands. He would hold one hand over the other hand. He'd hold his hands together. And the question is, why is that considered an appropriate stance for prayer? Why should a person pray holding his hands together, of all things? And the Ram says in Masechah Shabbos, the idea behind it is because it symbolizes helplessness. Whereas if a person has hands, there are things he can do for himself. But if a person doesn't have hands, right, you're pretty much helpless. Imagine a person who is trying to swat away the mosquitoes, but has no arms, no hands. you're pretty helpless. Right? If you have hands, you can do something. If you don't have hands, you can do anything. So the idea of clasping your hands symbolizes helplessness. That's how you stand before God when you pray. Now, there's a very interesting thing that the Shulchan Aruch says, that the person, when he prays, clasps his hands in front of him. That's how they used to do it. So there once was a shul where the rabbi used to hold his hands behind his back. And the people in the congregation used to make fun. Ah, look at the rabbi, the rabbi. Everyone else is this way. People always make fun. So they sent this question to the Tzitz Eliezer, was a great Talmid Chacham, whether is this a serious issue? Should the rabbi be advised to change his practice, to clasp his hands in front rather than behind? So he says no, because since the whole rationale is to demonstrate your helplessness, as if you have no hands, it really makes no difference whether you hold it together in front or hold them together in back. Either way, it accomplishes the same symbolism. That's what prayer is about. Therefore, when a person really prays, what he should feel is not a sense of confidence. Okay, I put in a word with the big one and I'm going to get answered. He should feel an overwhelming sense of humility, an overwhelming sense of total dependence on God, a total inability to fend for himself. That's really what a person feels. And that is a tremendous sacrifice. That is a carbon. Right? That is a person giving up what is most precious to himself, which is the sense of independence, self-worth, needing nobody else. And it's in that sense that a carbon is replaced by prayer. Just like the idea of the carbon is the total self-negation to God, prayer is also, when it's done properly, an aspect of self-negation to God, as if to say that I'm not all I think I am. I'm not able to take care of myself, not my health, not my livelihood, etc. I'm totally dependent on you. And by the way, this secret of prayer, if it isn't practiced in our prayers, it certainly is part of the 12-step program. In other words, every 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous or Gamblers Anonymous, etc., one of the 12 steps is the recognition that we are totally reliant on God. And there's really nothing we can do for ourselves without His help.
But that shouldn't leave one hopeless because of our view of what God's desire is for.
No, I understand that. In other words, when I say hopeless, it's not hopeless. It's helpless.
Right.
In other words, we are not hopeless because we know that God can do anything, but we are helpless in the sense that we realize that everything we do is...
I mean, we're in the hands of Allstate. You remember that ad?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. We're in the best
hands.
We're in the best situation, like the song. He's got the whole world in his hands.
Yeah. I remember the story that you used to tell about the Rav who was very poor and his wife was always worried and he wasn't.
That's right. Yeah. I told that story. There was once a rabbi. I was very poor. He was very, very happy. Nothing faced him. His wife couldn't take it. She was always doing without. And one day she just comes and she bangs on the table. I can't take it anymore. We have no money. We're starving, and I'm pulling my hair out, and you're studying happily. So he says, "Listen, I understand where you're coming from. That you are relying on me for your livelihood. Well, if you're relying on me, you're in a lot of trouble. Right? I'm relying on God. Right? There's no problem. There's truth to this. Now, I'll tell you an amazing story. I think I said it before. There was a great scholar, the Aleph from Nevada. Now, he established a chain of yeshivas in Russia and later in Poland. Great, tremendous self-sacrifice. And there were times you had to go and try to raise money to feed the students. So he had heard there was a very wealthy person in a certain town, and he decided to take the train to that town to solicit donation from this very wealthy individual. So he was accompanied by a student. They took a train to that town, and when they arrived at the town, they discovered that the train station was several kilometers from the person's house. So how are they going to get there? So the student says, let's call a carriage. So he says, no, we can't afford that. No, the yeshiva has no money. We have to walk. No, they walked. Finally, they got there, and they were brought into the very wealthy person, and they asked for a donation, and the wealthy person turned them down. So the whole trip was for nothing. So when they leave the house, so the rabbi says to the student, we have to take a carriage to the train station. So the student says, I don't understand. He says, on the way here, when we had hopes that we'd make some money, you said we couldn't afford it. So now you know that we've come away empty-handed. So now we're going to spend the money on a train. So Aleph says to the contrary. He says, until now, we had placed our trust in a human being. So the ability of a human being to help is finite. So we have to conserve. We can't waste the money. He says, now we know that we are totally dependent on Hashem. We're dependent on Hashem. There's plenty of money. We can afford the carriage too. No, we have to know that. We have to know that. That's the idea of prayer being a replacement for sacrifice. In other words, it's that aspect of prayer. Prayer is, yes, in a sense, self-serving. You're praying for the things that you want. But in a way, when you pray for something, not having it is less painful than asking for it. If you really think about it, you'd rather do without it than ask for it. There are many things in life that are like that.
Sure.
In other words, I'd rather forego it than have to beg you for it. Right? Many things in life are like that. So when we beg the Rebbeinu Shlomo for all the things, it's self-effacing. By the way, this may be one reason why the rabbis made prayer obligatory. Because there's a tremendous temptation not to pray. In other words, we like to carry on the illusion of being able to take care of ourselves. So we find all sorts of excuses not to pray.
Especially seeing around people who don't pray.
Yeah.
That's
So
okay.
the rabbis going to look right now. You have to pray. Once you have to pray, you're forced to face your own shortcomings. But that's the aspect of prayer. That in that sense, prayer replaces the sacrifices. So I think that's why it could be that it's just in this parsha the Torah hints this humility of Moshe Rabbeinu. This is the introduction. This is what a sacrifice is meant to do. And, it's an amazing thing because often a person brings a sacrifice and it's the exact opposite experience. He's so proud of what he gave God. When the person brings his prize steer to the base of Mikdash and says, look what I brought. That person brought a duck. This person brought a lamb. And I brought this magnificent specimen. I did a dover gok. I did a great thing. That is missing the whole point of sacrifice. The whole point of sacrifice is to make a person humble before God. That a person understands that what am I? I am nothing. I defer every aspect of my life to the will of God. That's symbolized by the slaughtering of the animal. A sacrifice is meant to be an expression of one's humility, one's deference to God. Because a person is meant to feel very, very contrite and very, very, very insignificant before God. And it's like all things in life. The pasuk says, "Ki yisharim Darchei Hashem." The ways of God are straight. Tzadikim yelchu bam u'poshim yikoshlu bam. The righteous follow the ways of God, and the wicked stumble on them. Meaning that some people get it right, and some people will perform the same ritual and get it wrong. Yeah.
I almost see the humility aspect in prayer. I still don't see it with sacrifice. I don't understand how sacrificing an animal that I'm bringing causes me to be humble or...
It's symbolic. It's on the symbolic level. Well, that's me over there, right? Let me give you an example. We all have dreams for the future, right? We all have very sweet dreams. It's almost, there's no sweeter time than when we're fantasizing about the future. When the lottery is $50 million, and we're planning how we're spending the money. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go here and go there and buy this and buy that, and it's going to be great. Those are fantastic. And then you wake up to reality. No jet, no yacht, no mansion,
Hydro bill.
no endowed chair in the university, everything else. And you realize that, what are you? You're the same poor fella that you were before you had the fantasy. It was sweet while it lasted, but it's not true. Okay? That's humbling when you think about that. That's what the sacrifice is. Everyone has plans. Everyone has desires. Everyone has a future that they look forward to living. And you stand before God and say, listen, I'm in your hands. Whatever you want. If you want me to have a future, I'll have a future. If you want me to die right now, I'm ready to die now.
So I understand that part.
Right? That's what the karma symbolizes. In other words, I am willing to subject myself totally to God's will, even if it means death, even if it means that this is the end.
The people that brought the sacrifices, did they watch the whole...
Sure they watched.
That was part of the...
I think that's part of it. And let's put it this way. You can choose not to watch. But your wife can have a baby and you also choose not to watch. Right? You can do anything. In other words, but obviously if you choose not to watch, you're missing something, right? That goes without saying. In other words, you can, you don't have to go to your own wedding. You can send a shliach. But you don't do it. You're missing something.
It happens actually regularly at a bris.
What?
It happens regularly at a bris.
That what?
Some people can't watch.
Yeah.
They can't watch.
Yeah, it's tough. The sight of blood is difficult. Yeah.
But the thing is, many people brought sacrifices. There's a lineup. There are a lot of animals, etc. So I guess I'm missing the...
Yeah, look, it's like everything in life. There are a lot of people that just miss the point. Right? As I once quoted, there was a pitching coach for the Nets. It was Wes Westrom. He said, baseball is like church. Many attend, but few understand. You can say the same thing about...
Lifetime batting average of 93.
About korbanos. It's the same thing. Many attend, but few understand. That's what we're trying to get at. Like, what are you meant to think about? Does that mean everyone thought about it? No. Many people didn't think about it. Many people might have had the exact opposite thought. Many people probably thought that we're giving God a barbecue, and it's great. I'm giving him not just the scraps, but I'm giving him grade A prime, barbecue, and they thought they're doing a double gobble for God. That, of course, is a misunderstanding of what it is. Yes.
Does it mean that the Muslims got it really to the point, unlike many of us? It's a total submission. The Islam itself, the word means total submission.
Yeah, it's true. I think there are some true elements to Islam, but you have to avoid the trap, which many people fall into, right? Which is the admiration of one's devotion to a cause without evaluating the worthiness of the cause. In other words, we admire the people who train for the Olympics in these very odd sports that come out of the woodwork every 4 years. The luge, the skeleton, You know anything about? It was interesting. I don't know if you're going to tape this, but I saw in the paper they said that 99% of Canadians watched something of the Olympics.
Terrible.
Now the luge, though, is not as crazy as the skeleton. The luge is you're going feet first, right, on your back.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one level of mishigas. The skeleton is you're going head first on your stomach.
Yeah.
It's even crazier. 150 kilometers an hour down this thing. We admire these people who sacrifice everything to perform these athletic feats. And the truth is like this. Yeah, it's very commendable that they sacrifice for the sake of this, but for what? You have to evaluate the worth of the cause. I mean, Rabbi Gottlieb points it out this way. Imagine you have a person who has the talent to be the world's greatest hand water skier. He can water ski on his hands. He has the talent. He can be the best. And anything else, he'd just be second best. If he'd devote his life to cancer research, he'd never be the greatest. He'd only be the second best cancer researcher in the world. So what would you say he should do? He should actualize his talent to be the best and water ski in his hands? Or should he become the world's second best cancer researcher? I think those of us who still have some clarity of thought would say it's probably more worthwhile to be the world's second best cancer researcher than the world's absolute best hand water skier. So it can't just be the devotion, right, that is measured. It has to be that you look at the value of the cause. So Islam may be total submission, but you have to understand the worthiness of the cause. What does it really stand for?